Good afternoon, everyone. Have you thought about how you're going to enter the historical record? Don't worry, I'm not asking you to confront your own mortality this afternoon, but think about it for a moment. How are your notes, your papers, your documents, all those kind of things? Are future historians going to look at those? I have a box of letters. My grandmother wrote me one letter per week, every week that I was in college, and I have that box in my basement. And this summer, I went into the basement, and the water was pouring down from the kitchen up above right onto the box. Luckily, all the letters survive, but just think of what would happen in another 10 years. You have an ungrateful grandchild that doesn't keep the letters. All the records start to disperse and they start to disappear. But don't worry, most of you are going to be a part of the historical record because unless you evaded the US Census Bureau, you filled out a census form. And that's how most human beings enter the historical record. Not in letters or newspapers or things like that. Most people enter the historical record as numbers. Now, numbers can be dehumanizing, but they can also be a way for us to understand the patterns of social relations and the lived experiences of many more humans that never left a document behind, but were counted by some kind of a census or a commercial record or something along those lines. So Dr. Murali and I are going to talk about two different projects at the Roy Rosenzweig Center. Now, unfortunately, both of these were NEH funded, and we recently learned that along with 1,000 other programs, $300 million across the country, that funding has been suddenly pulled. But nevertheless, we will persist with these projects, and we're working out a route forward with them. But we're excited to share with you some of the ways that we're bringing to life historical records where human beings entered the historical record in a quantitative way. So, Deepthi?
I'm going to read off a paper because I'm a rambler and I will be here all night if left to my own devices. So, Mohammed, thank you for that introduction. I am an art historian and a public historian, digital public historian. So what does that really mean? I basically study objects, specifically in my case, those that were made in 18th and 19th century southern India, and then kind of see how these objects went around globally and reflects in systems of power, colonialism, environmental change, and those sorts of things. So really looking at objects and objects interacting with humans across space and time. At Mason, my project Connecting Threads, Mohammed kind of briefly introduced it. It's actually about lower caste Indian weavers who produced these textiles in 18th and 19th century southern India, and then they were exported through various colonial traders to the US and the Caribbean, and they were used by free and enslaved women of color and largely black communities across these regions as a way of accessorizing themselves in a period where they were restrained from wearing hats and other types of accessories in both Caribbean and in the US. So here, my research is really something that feels like looking at a needle in a haystack, because we are specifically looking at these check textiles called Madras handkerchiefs that were used by a large swath of people, but usually the people that Lincoln mentioned who exist as numbers mostly in the records. So really it's like digging deep. We have gathered thousands of archival pages in our project from 7 different archives from US and Europe. A lot of them are in different languages: English, French, Spanish, and Dutch. We include ship logs, newspaper ads, lists, legal records, business documents, a lot of different types of documents that we look at. And then we are looking at all these as undigitized documents. And this poses a particular type of trouble for those studying histories of the global South. And the challenges are twofold. One is geographically accessing these archives that are often in Euro-American institutions as part of their colonial records. So getting there is a problem. But also, as Lincoln just said, we have funding and staffing issues on projects like these. Because they are also not digitized, they are also not available to do these large computational models that you can otherwise do as computational historians of the US or the Europe. So there is the lack of digitized data, and when digitized data exists, there's so much of it that we can't make sense of it. So in my case, AI lets me use, or I've done a pilot, so I'm still working on this, but AI does help us do research in Global South better in 4 different ways. In one way is that it just helps transcribe and create data sets pretty quickly. I did a pilot of about 125 pages from the British East India Company textile records last semester in under 50 hours. It would have taken me months to process those pages if I was doing this manually. So it is really helpful in getting work done quicker, but it's also easier now to build these data sets that makes this large swaths of data access to a larger number of scholars, so that starting point of having data does not become a problem anymore. So in our case, we look at a lot of records, and these records, we're just looking for Madras handkerchief, but we know that there's a lot of global textile trade data in there that we can now make accessible to other people who might want to look at for other textile studies, right? So that is one of the reasons why I would like to use AI in my work. The last one thing I'll kind of talk about, I'm trying to look at the time, is that it really does democratize access to data. A lot of our records live in Western institutions because colonialism. We have objects in Western institutions, colonialism. But the thing is, these histories belong to the Global South as well. And a lot of scholars and researchers don't get access to these records because of the geographic restrictions I mentioned earlier. So in order to make these viable data for scholars across the world to look at, we do need to democratize access, and AI is one of the ways in which we can actually do this. And I hope Lincoln can talk more about how exactly to use the data sets.
So Deepthi has shown us how you can use AI to go from a handkerchief to understanding global trade patterns. With the American Religious Ecologies Project, what we were working on is trying to understand the religious diversity in the United States roughly a century ago. A century ago was an exciting time in American religious life. The fundamentalist modernist controversy was reshaping American religion on conservative and liberal divides. The Pentecostal movement was just beginning, so charismaticism, speaking in tongues, miraculous healings, things like that were beginning. There was the Great Migration was leading African American Christians up out of the South and into urban cities. It's a wonderful time to study American religion. And in 1906, 16, 26, and 36, the federal government took a census of religious bodies. So not individual church members, but of congregations and other religious bodies like that. Yes, they were all like a bunch of white Protestants, and they tried to squish everybody into a white Protestant kind of a mold. They explicitly left out Muslims, which we're working to redress, and they basically tried to shape everybody in that way. But the 1926 Census of Religious Bodies is the single biggest data set for American religion that can ever exist for the period before the World War II. Somebody could imagine going out and creating some records of those things now, but for the historical record, we can't go back and remake data or whatever. We only have what the past created, and so we have 232,154 pieces of paper, one for each congregation across the country. Now, we have successfully digitized all of those. We're putting those up online. The difficulty is, how do you actually, remember all those human beings who enter the historical record as numbers? How do you get the numbers off of the digitized images? Well, we have had a small army of undergraduate transcribers working on those for the past 5 years. Students love working on the project. They get exposed to the past. They learn their work alongside working historians. But at the same time, transcribing numbers is maybe not anybody's particular idea of fun. And so what we have been able to do is pilot a program where we are working on transcribing those records using generative AI, and then comparing them to the records that the students have already transcribed. So we promised to the NEH that we would transcribe something like 20,000 of those 200,000 records. Now we think, using AI, we'll be able to do the complete data set and thus, create that final form, which will give us a comprehensive picture of American religion a century ago. But what about the poor student workers? Are they going to lose their jobs? No, that's not what we're talking about here. I know there's a lot of concern culturally about where jobs will be lost with AI and so forth, but what we are using this to do is to redirect that human effort towards understanding as opposed to the more mechanical aspects of historical research. So for example, we've had students track down what were these individual congregations, what were their neighborhoods like, who were their pastors, what were their membership likes in that way. And so that additional ability that we have lets us not just create the data set, but find the stories and the interpretive angles on it that really let us understand the full scope of American religious diversity. Thank you all.